Hey everybody, welcome back to Church Public. My name is Matt Odegaard and I am glad you tuned in today. There is a lot going on in the world and I generally cover news from a biblical perspective. Today, however, we're addressing some news, but really a larger scope, and that larger scope is going to be critical race theory. It has been a topic in the news over and over for a long time now. It actually is not new by any means. It's several decades old, and really, if you look at the inception where it came from, it's much older than that as well, which we'll look at in a moment. So this is a little bit of a longer episode. I hope that you can stay tuned or take it in parts. This also is an episode where there will be some slides and videos that you may want to see. So if you are listening on audio, I certainly appreciate it, but you can always go to churchpublic.com and see the videos there, or go to YouTube and search Church Public as one word. So as we begin, let's go ahead and get started. Well, again, welcome back to Church Public. I gave a seminar on this topic of critical race theory a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that I would share most of it with you. It, again, is a little bit longer, but I think it's important. I think it's important that we understand what this is all about. I will be touching on this really from an introductory perspective today, with some examples of how it's happening and what it means and how it interacts with Christianity, but it will inform some of our discussions going forward. So I felt like I had to get this out as kind of a big introduction so that you can at least understand the basis for what people are talking about. And the biggest problem is, this is a very confusing topic. It's very confusing because it originally was designed as a legal theory. And to be frank, I don't really even want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I have hesitated to talk about it. I don't like talking about it. I would much rather just talk about Jesus, preach the gospel, talk about things that are going on in the world as far as how we bring people to Jesus. But the reality is, as I have striven to equip people to engage in the public square through biblical worldview, I have to know the culture. And I think if you're here, maybe you have that idea too. You need to know the culture. You need to know what's going on here and around the world, and especially the country of America and the Western world, so that we can understand how to engage it and what we can do and what is a good track that we can run on and what is a track that doesn't lead to productivity. So I have now spent countless hours just on this topic, but over my career in all kinds of philosophies, and it all dovetails in. This is, again, it's just exploded across the country, across the news, but it is not new. It has been in America for decades, and really it has been in America even longer than that, almost 100 years now, but in a different form. And then it's even older than that if you go all the way back to its roots in Germany and some of the other countries in Europe. So we're going to look at a little bit of that. But one of the biggest things about critical race theory and capital T theory by and large is that it's really hard to understand, and it wasn't designed for regular people. It just wasn't. This is a bunch of philosophers and lawyers talking about how to deal with these kinds of things. So what I want to do first, talk about why is this so contentious? And it's contentious. You have people in politics saying that it exists or it doesn't exist, or you can't know it, or only certain people can know it. Then we're going to spend a few minutes at the history, because it helps us with the history to understand why this is so prevalent. And finally, we get to a proposal, my proposal, a solution at least for believers, if not for everybody, for the next steps forward. So, what is the problem? Why is critical race theory so contentious and prevalent right now? Part of it is the confusion about what it is. And it is confusing. And again, before we even get to either critical race theory or theory more broadly, that's a capital T theory, and we'll define that shortly. The biggest part of this whole thing is language. Really, really, the biggest part of this whole thing is language. And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is if we change what we say, and I will just throw it out there, I believe the left, the progressive left, has redefined words, and we think we know what those words are because some of the words are familiar. But they've also added words that nobody knows just to, I think, be confusing and to create this Gnostic, this unknowable verbatim that people can't know unless you know, and that really is how you get to woke. The idea of woke is to be awakened to something that you didn't know before, and you can only be awakened if you are indoctrinated into the awakening. So if you hear words like racism or anti-racism or intersectionality or hegemony or heteronormativity or queer black feminist studies, white fragility, white privilege, and on and on and on, then you know you're dealing with some of the theory or the underlying theory, both of critical race theory, critical social justice, critical whiteness studies. These are all things, these are all different different parts that come off of this main thing. But again, it becomes very convoluted as you move through it. And some of these words, the definitions have been remade into the image of what critical race theory and capital T theory more broadly wants them to be, and that's the first problem. When you talk about it, one person is talking about one thing and another is talking about another. And I think here's the problem that we get into, especially in the church. And a lot of this has gone into the church. It has gone into seminaries. It is very big in seminaries across the country today. And of course, in higher institutions and universities, but it also is very prevalent right now in elementary schools. I even read a story this morning about some of the things happening in Dallas, even in Texas, where people think things are totally different than the rest of the country. They're not. This is all over the country, and I've looked at many different places. I don't have time to go through all of the examples right now, but the examples are not actually hard to find either. And the problem and the beauty of Christians is that Christians are empathetic. We care about people, we care and we want to help. And you can even extend that out and say Americans. Americans are kind in general. They're kind people. Yes, there are mean people across America, sure. But in general, Americans are kind, and Christians especially are kind. And so we're empathetic to the situations of the oppressed. Jesus calls us to help those who cannot help themselves. That's one of these ideas in these prime directives of Jesus that he gives us through the love your neighbor. So you get into this place where talking about it is difficult because the terms are jumbled up and we want to be kind. And when you hear something like critical race theory, it sounds like you're just saying that you want to be critical of racism. And who doesn't want to be critical of racism? Everyone wants to be critical of racism. I guarantee it. No one wants to have racism. And so when you just say, I want to be critical of racism, yes, I want to be critical of racism. Let's do this. And that's where you get to this place where, unfortunately, that's not what it is. Critical race theory is not being critical of racism. In specifics, it has a much broader context to that because it really is an ideology, a worldview, as some writers have said, a cosmology, a ordering of the entire world. And we're going to look at that in a minute. But this confusion of language gets us to this place where all of a sudden we don't know whether it exists or not. And that's part of the problem where I'll just show you this slide. The largest teachers union in America says that critical race theory is reasonable and appropriate. And so they like it and they teach it. And so you have a huge teachers union saying critical race theory is great and we should all do it. And then you have, I'll show you this other one. This is another teachers union. And this is the American Federation of Teachers that just had a big conference. And you can see a part that I highlighted there that says, we deny that critical race theory is even being taught, except it's also, you can read on a little bit that says, but it's also okay if you want to teach it. So again, you have different educators, different people saying it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist, like commentators on CNN have said it doesn't exist anywhere. Then they've said it's only in law school. Then you say it's not in schools, but you have a big teachers union saying it is in schools, but then another one saying it's not in schools, but it's okay if it is in schools. Again, this leads to obviously a lot of confusion, and this confusion is what we're all feeling when we hear these words, when we don't understand these words. And as I mentioned, even just in the language, it's, I think, specifically designed to just be confusing. the thing that you have to realize about it is, and we'll look at why, and we will look at a definition in just a minute, but the thing about it is, it's a lens that covers the entire world. And that's how you have to look at it. So that's how you can have these two things at the same time. You can have a thing where it says it doesn't exist, and a thing that it can exist everywhere. Because you're not going into a school and saying, today, open up to page 33 of your textbook, and we're going to read about critical race theory and all of its legal jargon in third grade. Of course you're not doing that. The problem with this theory is, as we'll see in a moment, because it creates a lens that covers everything that you look at, right? If you put glasses on, right? You'd put your glasses on, and all of a sudden now I see differently in the world. And so how do you take your glasses off? And most people don't want to or can't take their glasses off. So they just see the world in the way their lenses color the world. And so you have the ideas, and that's where you get to some of this language. If you've heard some of these words in certain classrooms, it is the theory of critical race theory. It is the ideology that is present. And you can search, I'm not going to show you any today. We'll look at some later, but you can search through and see a lot of different teachers saying that they're going to teach these principles subversively. They have. I mean, again, I have tons of them saved as far as teachers who are saying, we're doing this even if we're not saying the words, because it is a practice. And that's where, again, you get to language. It's called a theory. But the reality, as we'll see in the definition in a moment, is that it contains activism. It contains a praxis or an activist component or a movement. It's designed to create action. And again, just by normal people definition, activism, movement, is not the same thing as theory. Theory is thinking about something, talking about something, seeing if something is real. Activating it, doing it, that's beyond a theory. That is a movement. That is activism. It is praxis. It's doing something. It's not just a theory. So we have to realize that this may have begun as a theory to evaluate racism in law or in society, but it has moved much beyond that, and it is now a lens that covers over the entire world, and you see the entire world in a certain way when you look at this. And when you look really through this would be a better way to say it. And the other contention is you can be on one side or the other. That's why it's hard to wade into this, because either you admit that it's fully real, that there is racism in America, and you're a proponent of critical race theory, or you deny there's critical race theory, and therefore you are racist because you deny that there ever was racism in America. Of course, actually neither of those things have to be true. Of course there was racism in America. In fact, there is racism in America, because as we'll look at in the Bible in a moment, even if you just look at Romans 3, we all have sin in our hearts, and racism is sin. Therefore, it is quite possible that we can be racist at any time, because we have the capability of sin, and we all have sin, as Paul says in Romans. So there is racism. Is there systemic racism? Do the systems created by America, was America created to be racist? That's the contention of critical race theory, that it intentionally was created to be racist. So can you say we had racism in the past, we had racist laws, we had slavery, those things are terrible, those things should be called out at every point possible, and we need to continue to work to root out racism anywhere we can? But can you also say that the end of critical race theory is a different end than what the gospel is? There is a middle ground here between denying that racism exists, denying that slavery existed, denying any of these things, and accepting the end result and accepting the tenets of critical race theory. And we'll look at definitions in just a moment. But this is why this is hard to get into, because people are afraid of being called a racist. And it is a terrible thing to call somebody a racist. No one wants to be called a racist. I probably will be, just because I am the wrong color to be talking about that. And I've been reading lots of comments and lots of other things that technically, and we'll see in the theory in a moment, I'm not even allowed to talk about this because you can only, I can't be awakened, I can't be woke enough to talk about this because my skin color is the wrong skin color. So we're going to look at that in just a moment. But again, I think one of the biggest pieces is I think people just believe critical race theory means to be critical of racism. And we should be, of course, at every moment. If there is racism from anyone, you should step in and say, no, this is not acceptable. We cannot judge people based on what they look like, what experiences they've been through. That is not how Jesus sees anyone, and that's not how we should either. So we have to figure out how are we going to deal with that, and how are we going to deal with this theory without getting sucked into this idea of racism. So let's just continue on, and we're going to look at the definition. And again, it's a complicated thing. I'm going to try to go, again, as a kind of an intro session into some of the pieces. I'm not going to spend time on all of the pieces, and it really isn't even possible to do that. This was designed as a legal course to be learned over the semester or the course of many years. And there are many, many, many books written about it. And even the proponents of it don't agree on everything, which is more confusing. We're just going to look at a few of the things, the tenets that most of the proponents, this isn't me, the proponents of it, believe in and agree with, and then we're going to go from there. So it did begin in the 1970s, as a way to identify inequity in different communities from a legal perspective. As I mentioned before, we can all agree there has been racism in America. There's been Jim Crow South. There have been terrible laws. There was slavery in America. Yes, there was. We fought a bloody war to end it. And people marched and overcame much of this in the 60s and 70s, and in like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a great victory over some of this, right? And that's a really important thing to maintain. And there are still racist people today, and unfortunately, you may or may not want to hear this, there will ever be racist people in the world. There just will. We looked at Romans 3 just a moment ago, and unfortunately, this side of heaven, while we are still being perfected into our holy bodies, if we follow Jesus, if we don't, all bets are off, because you're living in the sin of your nature, and therefore you're going to do the wrong things. That's just the gospel. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I would love to just talk about the gospel and our hearts, but unfortunately, this topic has exploded all over everywhere, so we've got to talk about it too. So the problem with critical race theory and its expansion into elementary school, into Hollywood, into media, into politics, in the church, is that it is not a theory. I mentioned that before, but it is not a theory. It was never a theory. You'll see in a second when I read it that it was made to go further than just thinking about it. And it was made to change the way the world works. And it is a movement that does something more than just think about. So this was begun by a lawyer named Derek Bell. He is credited with kind of inventing this whole theory. It was taken from there by Kimberly Crenshaw. You have the textbook that most people read from by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk. There are a bunch of other books. You have Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, a bunch of other people who are writing books now on topics that relate to this. But I want to turn to the most popular textbook on the subject. This is The Critical Race Theory, an introduction by Delgado and Stefanczyk. I'm going to edit a longer quote for time. You can read this for yourself if you want, or find it. But the point is, I'm just going to switch to my other view here. The point is that the language, even in this, one of the reasons I'm editing this is just because it's very difficult to understand a lot of this language. So I'm just going to read this. This is from their book. What do critical race theorists believe? Probably not every member would subscribe to every tenet set out in this book. They're describing their own piece. But many would agree on the following propositions. First, that racism is ordinary. And second, that our system of white over color ascendancy serves an important purpose. I'm going to end there. It gets into material and psychic. That means like using your mind, and large parts of of society. Again, it's a very convoluted phraseology, but those first two things are the really important things. First, racism is ordinary. It's important to understand this perspective that racism is central to the whole of human experience. Ordinary. It's not that it is something that some people do. It's not that it is something that bad people do. It is something that all people do, but not all people do this. That's why you get to number two. It's the white over color ascendancy. That's a power dynamic, right? A hierarchy. In their words, it would be hegemony. But again, these are very complicated terms, so we'll try to boil it down as much as we can. It's that if you are white, you are racist. So it's in ever-present time, in everything, and then because, as they would say, white people have established America, the founding documents, all of the systems and all of the structures, America, the founding documents, and all of the systems and all the structures are then also inherently racist. This is the A plus B equals C argument, right? So critical race theory becomes this lens to view the entire world. And it may be helpful to understand where critical race theory comes from if we back up a step from that. Because as I mentioned, this is from around the 70s, and there's a large amount of things that came before it that add up to it. And this is in the school of capital T theory. There are all kinds of theories: queer theory, gender theory, feminist theory, critical social justice. We talked about that, which is another theory. There is other kinds of feminism. I'm just going to show you this chart just to confuse you and add a lot to it. This is mildly undigestible. If you are at home and listening and not watching, it's a little bit tricky to see, but there's just a lot going on in this chart. And you can see that it comes through Marx, and there's a lot of other philosophers in there. And then you have all of these theories. You have Marxism, and then you have this thing called the Frankfurt School, if you're a good German. And that is where a lot of this came from in theory, where they took some of Marx's ideas and then changed them and moved them into more sociological pieces. So I'm just going to pull this chart off because you'll make yourself dizzy staring at it. The common dynamic in all of these is power. There are those that have and those that don't, and they all claim that the world's problems come from this imbalance of power. The power is based on some sort of identity which changes through each theory, and it changes here and there. So you have Marx, of course, that said there were those that had money and those that didn't have money. And in critical race theory, the power dynamic obviously is race. So the goal of any critical theorist is to liberate people, to remove them from these structures of power and create something new. Or really, it's not much about creating, it's really about destroying the old so that it doesn't affect people anymore. And then you eventually get to this utopia. You get to this place of, how I would call it, a heaven on earth. They often in their writings call it something like utopia, which I think in an ironic way actually means no place. Actually, by definition, it means no place. I think that's funny, but you get to this place where you try to find this paradise, you try to find this heaven on earth. So critical theory, the system that oppresses, was put in place by those in power, as we mentioned, and the system must be identified and destroyed. So you get to equity. And equity is that place where after everything, everybody's the same. Many, as I've talked about before, of the founding principles of America are that everyone has the same starting place. Like no matter where you came from, you can start at the same place and you can do as much work as you can to try to get past that and move into something else. And of course, we have had issues. We had slavery, we had bad laws on the books. Currently, there are no racist laws on the books. Actually, there is one, but it's in favor of minorities, so I'm not going to talk about it right now. So there are no laws on the books that push down any particular minority. There are not. Like, show me one. There is not one. So we've removed those, and we fought hard to get rid of slavery, and it was a long process, and many people died, and it took years even after the Civil War to realize everything in terms of freedom and opportunity. But this idea in all of these theories is not that the starting point is level, but that the end point is level. And this is the same as Marx, and when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, they did the same thing with power struggles, and their focus was on economics and finances. They looked at people who are poor, they looked at people who are rich, and said, capitalism is the problem and causing this. So this new system that he proposed, socialism that eventually led into communism, that eventually led to utopia. Again, read the Communist Manifesto and some of his other writings. The goal is to make it to communism, and then to make it past communism, where you don't have to enforce this anymore through the state, and everybody is level. Unfortunately, in practice, as many of you know, that led to the death of probably tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, because the state had to enforce the haves getting rid of and giving it to the have-nots. But somewhere in the middle of, well, I got this stuff from you, and now I'm going to give it to the people in charge kind of said, well, I'll just keep it. And they're doing fine. And again, if you don't believe me, look at Cuba. Cuba is a great example of Marxist and communist ideology, because people are poor and they have nothing. Nothing. I got into that a little bit the other day. I'm not going to spend time on that today because I have a lot more to cover. So in terms of these critical theories, they come from this Frankfurt School, where critical theory was born out of the ideas of Karl Marx and Engels, and then from Hegel before him, and even Kant a little bit before that. But again, that's getting very philosophical, and I'm not going to delve into all of the pieces there. You had Gramsci, and Marcuse, who began to assimilate these pieces together and move them from just economic issues to all of these different issues. And then through the next several decades, in American schools, mostly, some of the German schools, but mostly in American schools, you had these theorists like Derek Bell talking about critical race theory and critical social justice and some other theories that came out of that. But the bottom line is, all of these theories are trying to solve power dynamics. And all the theories are trying to, this is a big point for Christianity, all of these theories are trying to remove God and replace God with some form of state or government or authority to provide the safety, the prosperity, the equity, and the health to those that are oppressed. These theories are specifically, intently, read Marx, read Hegel, Gramsci. Some of their first principles are, we must remove religion. Some of them even specifically say Christianity and Protestantism, because religion is, and God is, the highest authority there is. And so if you're trying to establish a new authority, an authority that can level the field after everything happens, this equity, this leveling at the end of everything, there has to be authority for that. And God does not play that way. God believes in a justice based on what you've done, not based on where you're going. And I hope that makes sense. It's that you are judged based on what you do. You are not judged based on who you are in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Do you understand the difference? We all are sinners. Read through Romans. We all are sinners. And the good news is we have Jesus to help us through this. Because without Jesus, we cannot get to God's grace. We cannot. In any of these theories, or socialism or communism or Marxism, the way that you get salvation is to remove the objects of oppressor, or people that are oppressing, or systems that are oppressing. You need to remove them, and then you get to this place where the ground is level and everybody is happy. And unfortunately, as we've seen over and over and over again, when Marxism, socialism, communism are tried, that just leads to death. Jailing and ultimately death, because the people that think for themselves, the people that follow God, can't exist in that society, so they are removed from society or from the earth, period. And these theories then expand these economic ideas of Marx and Engels to the ideas like gender and sexuality and identity, and of course what we're talking about today, critical race theory. The commonality is all of these theories are some kind of lens. I showed you the glasses before. It's some kind of lens where you put on your lens, and now you're woke, and now you can see the power struggles. And this is where you get ideas like white fragility and white identity, and there's critical whiteness studies and all these other things where all of a sudden you can see the different power struggles, and now you're awakened enough to deal with it. So once you begin to understand the language that is used, this has all been about language, then you can start to hear people talk about this, even if they don't know what they're talking about. When you hear the evils of capitalism or the wonderful invention of socialism, you are hearing some form of critical theory, capital T theory. Marx was the grandfather of all of this, and he believed that once capitalism was destroyed and everybody had the same amount of everything, then you would reach this utopia. So critical theorists see the world in terms of removing these structures of oppression, white people. In critical race theory, we're removing white people. That's really the basest way that I can put it. The foundation of critical race theory is removing white people, because white people are both the symbol and the actor of oppression. And so they must be removed. And of course, this becomes a problem. It becomes a problem for the children of all stripes and all colors, either learning they are an oppressed person, which is terrible to teach a young kid that you are oppressed and you can't get anywhere in your life. That's a terrible message to send to children. Or to say that you are an oppressor because of who you are and because of what you look like, and there is no way for you to apologize enough out of that. That's also a terrible message. None of these messages are good. We shouldn't be teaching our kids to hate each other and discriminate against each other. We should be teaching them to love one another. That's why I keep pointing back to the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says we are to first love God, which is really important to this whole scheme as we talked about authority, and second, love one another. Not hate one another, not discriminate against one another, not judge one another based on what they look like. Over and over and over again, the stories in the Bible are not based on what people look like. In fact, you look at who Jesus talked to, the people who Jesus talked to, he should not have been talking to according to our standards, because we do judge people based on what they look like, and the whole thing is to rise above that and to get out of that and not judge people by what they look like. These theories are putting us back into our old patterns of sin and saying, you look this way, you are bad. That's not good for us. It's just not good for us. So I'm just going to play you this. I think this is a great thing to look at. This is one of my favorite responses to this. This is a black father who talks about how this just is not good for us as a society, and some of the personal things that he has run into because of this theory.
I've got 2 children here at the Caledonia School District. It's very apparent here by all of the parents that have spoken that this board and the school district is failing. More importantly, I came here to talk about critical race theory. This theory was never meant to be brought into grade schools, high schools, at all. It's actually taught in the collegiate atmosphere, and more importantly, the legal portion of the collegiate atmosphere, to see different laws through the lens of race, from an ethics and an ethical standpoint, right? Not for grade schools and high schoolers. The problem with bringing it to high school and grade school level is that we don't have the educators to properly teach these kids. Instead, they're using it as their own agenda to indoctrinate the kids to hate each other. And whether you believe that to be true or not, the reality is that's what's happening. Critical race theory is teaching that white people are bad. That's not true. That would teach my daughter that her mother is evil. You already have an educator within your staff that has pulled my daughter aside and said, well, you're a minority, so you know better than to engage in certain things.
Wow.
Whoa. When I was brought to the school's attention, nothing happened to the educator. Instead, my daughter was brought in, and she was ridiculed. So my question is now, with critical race theory being brought in, what is your criteria to educate the educators? And who are you to educate my children, or any of our children, in life issues? That's our job.
Yes.
Your job is to teach them math and science. Our job is to teach them about life. I believe racial issues and tensions across the U.S. are nowhere near what they used to be decades ago. Do we have a long way to go? Sure. Do we still have individuals out there that need to be taught? Absolutely. But I believe the people here don't look at me as a black man. They look at me as a man standing in front of you, addressing an issue that we all are very passionate about.
So hopefully you could hear some of that. I just think it's super important that we understand, and he said so many things really well that I'll just touch on a couple really quickly, that he, a black guy, is married to a white girl, I apologize. Black man, white woman. So I guess in this racial soup that we're stuck in with this critical race theory, you'd say that it's a biracial child. But the poor child now is as he points out, is either being taught to hate his mother or feel like they're oppressed and can't do anything right. Did you hear that kind of language where they had to go into the office to deal with this? Like, this is terrible, and these are some of the conclusions that you come to when you base your worldview on what people look like. There's no good end to this. You don't get to the end of this based on what you look like, and there is no utopia where it's paradise on earth. As this man mentioned, is there still problems? Are there still problems in this world that we need to deal with? Yes, of course. I don't think anyone is denying that. And that's the thing that I want to talk about all the time. There are still problems, and by and large, most of the problems are because we have sin. We have sin, and we need to deal with sin. And the problem is, we struggle to want to have God in control, so we try to create God in something else, just like Hegel and Marx and Gramsci and Marcuse and all these others, Bell and Crenshaw and D'Angelo and Kendi. They're trying to create this worldview without God, and we run into these problems because this world and morality do not make sense without God. And that's where we get to the founders creating this rule of law. And it's important that we see the rule of law. I'll just show you this picture. This is Lady Justice. If you're not familiar with this, you probably have seen it, but Lady Justice is blind. She has a blindfold on. And she's holding two scales. This problem of critical race theory creates an issue for justice, because expressly under the rule of law, which is by and large based on the Ten Commandments, she's blind because it shouldn't matter how much money or power or authority you have. It should just be based on whatever you do, that is the justice that you receive. And that's where you get the scales. The scales are balanced because whatever, I was going to say sin, but in this case, just in law, whatever offense you do, whatever crime you do, should have an equal punishment. It should not have a really high punishment for a really light crime, or vice versa. The justice is supposed to equal the crime, not more or less. But if justice is not blind, if justice is not just, instead the scales are pre-weighted based on something else besides the law. And that is what critical theory, critical race theory are trying to do. They're trying to pre-weight the scales. They're trying to open up justice's eyes to see something that may or may not be there, and then delve out justice based on what she sees, or what the proponents of critical race theory see. Justice is based on what is seen and not what is real. And this is back into that postmodern deconstruction, which I don't have time to talk through all of it today. But that's part of Marxian philosophy, and there's a bunch of other things in there, but basically it's just that there is no truth, and you take truth out. And so objectivity, science, data, statistics, math, all of it is relative, and that all comes from this postmodern deconstruction theory. And critical race theory states the truth instead comes from the individual or the group. So there is no answer to some of these things. It depends on your perspective. And this is another big word that they kind of invented that is called standpoint epistemology. Basically, wherever you stand and your circumstances, that's your morality, that's your view, that's what's happened to you. And you've heard this, like, find your truth, live your truth, you do you. And your circumstances actually do dictate who you are, what you've done, and how you view the world. This is why in critical race theory, white people and white men, and especially white Christian heterosexual men, cannot ever find the truth, because their standpoint is in the wrong place. Because I am that, I can never see the standpoint of someone else. And there is truth to that. I don't know how you have lived your life. I don't know how anyone has lived their life, because I've only lived my life. But that's defining truth by my experience, which we've talked about many times on this show, because that just leads to chaos and anarchy. Rather than, if you can't see, I'm holding up the Bible, defining truth not from inside of you, but from something bigger, that is God, and God who is truth, that creates the natural order, that creates the rule of law, that shows us what rules and laws are, like 10 commandments, that then can define our reality and create order and justice. God is a God of justice. That is one of the attributes of God. But if we remove justice from God and try to create justice based on something else, we do not end up with justice. We end up with injustice. So the standpoint of the oppressed trumps any standpoint or facts presented by the oppressor. We have to continually point back that this system, the outcome, has nothing to do with choices. It's everything to do with systems of power and oppression. So in critical theory, critical race theory, critical social justice, personal choices don't matter. It doesn't matter if you've done well. It doesn't matter if you've struggled. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter. The only thing that affects your outcome is race. That's why justice is so important to us in the Bible, and why if we remake our justice system based on this instead of justice, we'll actually have systemic injustice. But this critical social justice, this critical race theory, this is what is being called for. I'll just read you a quick quote from Ibram X. Kendi, who is one of the proponents of this, and he says that the only way to move forward is not to look at justice being blind, not to look at justice being equal. In his book on how to be an anti-racist, he says that you have to actually counter past discrimination with present discrimination and future discrimination. He says there is no racist. I'm sorry, the opposite of racist is not, I'm going to try to say this right, I apologize. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. I know this is even hard to talk through. I apologize for stumbling there. It's just, this is very complicated, and it's not intuitive because it's not intuitive. So there is no not racist neutrality. Either you are racist and you know it as a white person, or you deny you're racist as a white person, so you don't know it, but you're still racist. You see how you're stuck in this trap of you are always racist. That's that ordinary racism that we talked about in the definition at the beginning. You are racist, and either you accept it and know it, and that's white acceptance, white fragility, whiteness studies, or you deny that you're racist, and then you are racist, but you don't know you're racist. And so then you have more work to do to become not racist. But then that's not the end. You have to become anti-racist. And even poor Tom Hanks got in trouble for this. I'll just show you this real quick. Excuse me, Tom Hanks. Here he is. He wrote this letter, and they really liked his letter. They said he is definitely not racist, but he needs to be more anti-racist. I think on my screen it got cut off a little bit. But anyway, this letter that he's done really well at saying he's not racist. That's great, but unfortunately, it's not just enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. You have to do more. And the idea in justice is that it's not that the playing field is not level. It's not that the scales are not level now. It's that it needs to be tilted in favor of the disadvantaged. And this is just socialism and communism taking another form. It's that you have to push people into a different place and you have to push some people down so that the other people, the oppressed, can rise up. This is how this theory works. And unfortunately, just look at countries that have done this, like Russia and China and Venezuela and now Cuba, which we see. It doesn't end up in having justice for all, like America is founded on, though we've not always reached. We aim for. It ends up in injustice for almost all. And there's a little bit of person, little people at the top who get everything, and that's what ends up happening here. And so we have to figure out how to live with this in a different way. Yes, there are problems. In no way am I saying there aren't problems in the world. In no way am I saying there's not racism in this world. There is some, and again, we need to call it out. But to claim that everyone who looks a certain way to be inherently racist and inherently responsible for all of the sins of all of the people in the past who may or may not have even looked like them, this becomes a problem. It becomes a problem, and it's not what America was based on. The problem is, do you take what America was based on, which is Judeo-Christian values mixed with Athenian, Greek worldview and politic structure, and try to continue to build on that and continue to get better, as we have when we abolished slavery and abolished Jim Crow laws and created civil rights acts and those kinds of things? Do we continue to get better, or do we burn the whole thing down and replace it with what? And the proposal, I didn't grab this clip, but Ibram X. Kendi even wrote a proposal that there should be a constitutional amendment that is for an anti-racist part of the government that has no oversight and is not elected, but it is just a panel of people who are hired to look at any policy, and they are given power to give consequences to any system or person that is deemed to be racist. Does that sound like it will end in justice, or how do you determine? And what if there is a problem? What if one of the results is wrong? How do you find recompense for that? You can't, because it's not elected. There's no way to get rid of this amendment. It becomes a really big problem, and is not justice. It becomes injustice. Again, we have to look at the history. I'm not saying don't teach history. Of course, I learned history. I've taught all of my kids the bloody gore of the Civil War and why we had to fight it and why it was so important, and civil rights laws and violations even at that. Like, we should learn all of those things. There's probably even more we can learn about those things. But to intentionally teach different children they are either good or bad based on what they look like is not loving. It is not loving to anyone. I can't say that strongly enough. It's not loving to the white kids. It's not loving to the black kids. The poor Asian kids are somewhere in the middle, which is a topic for another day that I don't have time to talk about today. But this idea that white supremacy and racism are the root of all of the evil in America or the world is just not. That there's bigger things going on. And it's that, like Ibram X. Kendi has said, that the original sin of America is white supremacy. That's what he said. The original sin of America is original sin. The original sin of every human is original sin. We have sin. We do things wrong. We do all kinds of things wrong. This is very myopic in its scope. Yes, racism is a big problem. There's a lot of other big problems. Murder is a big problem. Stealing is a big problem. Coveting is a big problem. I'm not even go through them all. There's so many things that are also big problems. Adultery is a big problem. There's a lot of big problems. Pornography is a big problem. There are so many big problems that we have to deal with. We cannot get hung up on one big problem. We have to look at the bigger issue, which is the heart is broken inside humanity, and the only solution is Jesus Christ. And that is the solution that I propose. Not everyone is going to like this solution, and I recognize that, because wide is the gate that most enter through, and narrow is the gate that is hard to find, according to Jesus. That narrow gate is following Jesus, but we need to preach the gospel. The only way through this is to pray a lot and to preach the gospel. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 12, just as a body, though one, has many parts, all of its parts form one body, so it is with Christ. This is the message of Jesus Christ through Paul the apostle. He continues in 2 Corinthians 5, therefore if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here. That is talking about your spirit inside you, not your flesh. The flesh that we have is broken and weak and leads us to sin, regardless of color. That is what it does. Jesus wants to give you a new heart, a new spirit inside of yourself that changes you from the inside out. And there, not that your culture doesn't matter, not that your history doesn't matter, but you are made new, and you're made new in Christ. And now, as Paul said earlier, you're in the body of Christ, and that body of Christ is the most important thing, not what you look like. And if we continue to say only what you look like matters, or the gospel is only for certain skin colors, or racism is only for certain skin colors, like, this is a trap that the devil has laid for us, and many people are falling into it. And we can't let that happen. And it's a problem. It's a problem that we're going to have to start talking about, even if they tell me that I'm not allowed to talk about it. The gospel is not a secret. It can be found, and we have to begin saying what it really is. And we need to stand up against these ideologies, these worldviews that are fighting against the gospel and trying to remove God and trying to replace God with something else. This is trying to replace God with new gods, whether that's making a new god out of yourself or one of these other people. They're becoming the idols or the priests of this religion. It's bad. And Christianity can't live in the same place as this. Critical race theory is antithetical to Christianity because of these things, and then especially because of the image of Christ that we're made in. Paul in Galatians 3:28, this is probably the best verse for this, says we're neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, rich or poor, etc. Like, we are who we are in Christ. This is not about our external circumstances or external what we look like. It's about who we are and having Christ at the center of who we are. Yes, again, you can be glad about your history, your culture. We can celebrate that. We can grow in that. You don't have to get rid of any of that, but we can't make that the only thing about us. If we are believers, if we are followers, Jesus says this is the most important thing. And he even says the least will become the greatest. I love this fight. I don't love it, but this fight that James and John have, the sons of thunder. They have this fight where they say, hey, Jesus, I want to sit on one side of you and he's going to sit on the other side of you. Like, is that cool? And Jesus goes like, guys, you're not getting it. This is not about power. And again, the reason I bring this up, this whole theory, capital T theory, critical race theory, all of these theories are based on power. Who has the most power or who doesn't have the most power? So you have to upseat the people that have the most power. This whole thing is about power. Jesus says it's not about power. Jesus says the least will be the greatest. Jesus says the servant is the highest form of leadership. Jesus died as a servant on the cross for you. This is not about uprooting those. It's not a movement. Christianity is not a movement to remove those people in power. It's a movement to show that you can serve, because that's the gospel. How do you serve one another? How do you love one another? We need to be humble before God. We need to recognize that God is real and sin is real, and we have redemption through Jesus Christ. Critical race theory says God is not real and equity is the goal, and the goal is to remove only racism, because that's the only sin that matters. But there's a lot of sin that we have, as I was talking about before, and God's kingdom through Jesus is accomplished through redemption in Jesus, period. And I don't think there is any redemption in critical race theory. Like, I've read a lot of their material as a white, heterosexual, Christian, male, father who's married, with children, living together. I don't think there's any redemption in their religion for me. I don't think there is. I've searched all kinds of their literature, and even if you find this anti-racism, or at least get a little bit of it for a little while, it only takes one thing to knock you back down to the bottom, because it's who you are. It's based on what you look like, and I can't change the way I look like. That's how God made me. I might be pretty, I might be ugly, I don't know, but this is me. This is who I am, and I can't change it. No one should have to change what they look like to find salvation. That is, again, antithetical to the gospel. You can't change what you look like. That's, in fact, what people have been fighting about in America for a couple hundred years. It doesn't matter what you look like. It only matters who you are. And if you have Jesus in your heart, you become a better person. That is the beauty and the truth of the gospel, through the power of Jesus and the power of the Spirit. And we need to be faithful to God, and we need to pursue after God in that. And without God, I don't think we can do this. And we keep trying to find, as humans, we keep trying to find these new ways to create God and create morality, and it's just not possible. We are called to love one another, and we need to love one another. And Jesus is perfectly clear on this, but it's a personal choice. And it's why socialism sounds good. It sounds like socialism, Marxism, communism, critical race theory are all good because you're loving others. But the problem is you cannot be forced to love others. Everyone who's seen every movie or read every book knows you can't be forced to love somebody. You can't. It doesn't work. You have to choose to love someone. And Jesus asks you to choose. And Jesus asks you to deny yourself. I can't make you do that. No one can make you do that. And that's why this whole anti-racist movement doesn't work, because you can't make me be anti-racist, especially if I don't think I'm racist. If I do something wrong, I will always apologize for it, however hard that is. I try to be humble and I try to be self-aware. But if I haven't done something wrong, I don't know how to apologize for it, because I haven't done it. And I'll do a whole other separate episode that I'm working on as far as the biblical view of, do you now carry the sins of your father? Because there is covenantal theology in the Old Testament that what your fathers did, you have some responsibility for them. But good news, We are not in the old covenant. We've moved into the new covenant under Jesus, and it's different under the new covenant. Everything is different under the new covenant, and we need to live in a new covenant reality if we're Christians. If you want to be Jewish, that's a different thing. We can talk about that at a different time, but that's a whole nother lesson. I'm coming from a specifically Christian worldview where we are not bound by the sins of our father. That's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have your sin that you need to reconcile with through Jesus. Period. That's it. Once you do that, you are free from the law, the power of sin, the power of death, according to the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. We cannot be compelled as a society to do the right thing. Every time that happens, it just creates death. Again, look at all these countries that I rattled off before. We need to, in our families, teach our children morals and values and faith. And this culture wants all of these things, morals and values and faith, to happen at school, to happen in Hollywood, to happen in the government. And that's not where it happens. This education of morals and values and faith must come from families. You, the mother, the father, the grandmother, the grandfather, you have to instill in your children the values and morals and faith of the Bible and build these communities up, then moving into the local church and growing in the body of Christ that is not dependent on race or gender or any other tribal ideology, but is on the blood and body of Jesus Christ, our Lord. I'm going to wind up here because I, again, knew I was going to go longer than I wanted, but I'll just finally say, Christians, and if you're not a Christian, you're listening to this, message me. I'd love to talk to you about Jesus if you're interested, but if you are a Christian, you need to get involved, and you need to figure out what that looks like, and you need to figure out how to get involved. Again, if it's just leading your family, fantastic. If you're joining the school board, you should do that. If you want to run for office, we need people who have Christian morals and values in office that can help. I just talked to a guy who became a city official in my town, and I got to talk with him. He didn't know much of this at all, and I got to say, you are in such a great spot that God has placed you, because now you can protect the city from these kinds of destructive ideologies and dogma and false religions. So God may have something for you to do. Speak up. Your voice may be just what your neighbor needs to hear about Jesus or your school board or the city officials or wherever. And pray about this. And when you pray for opportunities, know that God will answer that prayer, and be ready and be bold to speak truth and life into them. Of course, with grace. I hope you know that I'm trying to be sensitive to this. And I know this is a sensitive topic and people are probably going to hate me for it. But to be hated for the truth, to be hated for the gospel, is to be called favor to God, because I'm trying to do the best I can. And some people are not going to like this because it's going against the world. And as we've talked about many, many times, if you go against the world and you side with God, the world is not going to like you. And we have had a wonderful time of freedom in this country where you can kind of do whatever you want, kind of believe whatever you want. That time is basically over. It's over. You either side with the culture and get along with what they're saying and practice your woke religion, or you follow Jesus. There is no other way. You could try and hide on the sidelines, but I guarantee you if it's not in your school now, it will be in your school very soon. There is no state that is going to move this. Like, it's happening. It's happening all across the country. Believe me, I have looked. And you need to check. You need to get involved with your kid. I just even read this morning, there are teachers saying, don't listen, don't watch, don't show your parents these lessons, because they're teaching this stuff to your kids, and you need to know, and you need to be informed, and you need to be involved. So I hope that you follow after Jesus first, and I hope that you lead your families, and I hope that you can just live out the love of Christ in everything you do. And I hope, of course, that you keep the faith. God bless. We'll see you next time.